Hello, I'm the awesome Tutor, and actually today we'll be studying history. Now, I'm not going to go over any content because there is a lot of content for history. So instead, I'll be going over a Cold War international relations past paper. I think it's 2015 one. And basically, if you have an understanding of what goes on, the content, what happens when, you'll be fine. So you just basically need to study the exam technique and the facts and statistics once for your evidence in your answers once you've gone over the content by yourself, which you should have done in class already. So yeah, let's get started. So this is question 1. Now question 1 basically requires you to very simply just pick out 2 points the source makes. So let's look at the source. Alexander Dubček introduced a series of reforms which became known as the Prague Spring. Czechs called his policies socialism with a human face. He began to make Czechoslovakia less repressive and announced free elections. Dubček also announced a reduction in the powers of the secret police. Dubček wanted to end travel restrictions to the West and allow all Czechs and not just a few trusted communists to go there. By July 1968, Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had become concerned by these reforms. Let's get back to the question. Give 2 ways from source A which show how Dubček introduced a series of reforms which became known as the Prague Spring. So this is really easy. Looking through the source, I can see this one. Announce free elections. Remember to make them as simple as possible because it's only 2 marks. You could also say that Dubček also announced a reduction in the powers of the secret police. You're basically quoting from the source, or you could also paraphrase from it. Anyway, next question. Question 2. Outline 2 steps that Brezhnev took to oppose the policies of Dubček. Now question 2 will usually be related to question 1, but requires only your own knowledge. To get 4 marks, give 2 points. First, say something from your own knowledge, a step that Brezhnev took, and then just a little bit of development, and do that with your second point as well. For example, the most obvious one to do is say that Brezhnev sent 500,000 Warsaw Pact tanks and troops. And he sent them when? He sent them from the 20th to the 21st of August. That's your precise knowledge, 500,000 and 20 to the 21st of August. Examiners will like that. Then you just need a little bit of development. You could say that some students tried to resist, but the army did not fight back. Or you could say that perhaps the USSR is showing that they are in charge and asserting their power. Now the second point might be a little bit hard to think of, because the first point is actually the easiest one, the most obvious that most students will get. But the second point is one that only the students who really know their content will get it. You see, Brezhnev, he also created a doctrine. Separately from the Prague Spring reforms, you might not be able to link them. But if you do find the link, you can put it into this question. So your second point. Brezhnev created the Brezhnev doctrine. Now remember your specific knowledge. Brezhnev created the Brezhnev doctrine in 1968. And to develop it, just describe a key feature of it that relates to the question, such as it stated that the USSR would intervene in any communist state if communism was threatened. And that would be your 4 marks. Okay, so question 3. How useful are sources B and C as evidence of the reasons for the USA's involvement in the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your own knowledge. So you have to use your own knowledge. This question is out of 10. If you do not use your own knowledge, you will be marked out of 6 instead, which will mean a reduction in 4 marks automatically, no matter how good your answer is. So for this question, you have to talk about the reliability, but mostly the usefulness of each source. This is similar to the question in the Britain paper about reliability, and is also awarded the same amount of marks. So you have to mention usefulness or limitations of content and NOP. What's NOP? NOP is nature, origin, purpose. For example, the thing that they put on top of the source that says where it's from and who made it, for example. And to gain the maximum marks, you have to talk about both content and NOP for both sources. And you have to give at least a positive and a negative, no matter whether it's for content or NOP, for both sources. You have to do that to get full marks, which might be quite difficult at first, but if you have enough practice, you can do it. And you do not have to give a lot about specifically content or specifically NOP. You have to be judicious with your time and where you focus your answer. Now, onto the sources. Source B is a cartoon published in a US newspaper, June 1948. So the first thing you should notice about its nature, origin, and purpose is it's a cartoon, it's in a US newspaper, and it was published June 1948. Now, what happened during June 1948? This was the Berlin blockade, as well as the Berlin airlift. And in this source, you can clearly see that the eagle represents America and the bear represents Russia. And the whole source is basically referring to the Berlin blockade itself. So that's its content. Now, what can we talk about for usefulness and the limitations of both the NOP and the content in order to answer the question? Okay, so the NOP. Now, what is the actual question? The question is about the reasons for the USA's involvement in the formation of NATO. And because this source has been published in a US newspaper, it is directly showing the USA's involvement. And from the content, we can also see that as the USA was involved in the Berlin blockade. And how can you use your own knowledge here? You can mention the Berlin airlift. When was the Berlin airlift? The Berlin airlift was started the 20th of July 1948. You don't have to talk about how many planes were in the Berlin airlift or what they actually did, but just mention something about your own knowledge to support your points. So the NOP is useful in that it shows us the USA's involvement. However, what are its limitations? Well, it's in a US newspaper, and it's showing the USA and Russia referring to the Berlin blockade. There's definitely going to be some bias here. And how can you know that? Well, from the source, from the actual content, you can see that the US eagle is made to be strong and show the power of the USA, whereas the USSR, or Russia, is shown to be menacing, and also, when it says here, no pushover. So that shows the strength of the USA over Russia. So there is definitely some bias here. How is that limiting to the source? Well, it decreases reliability because there might be some exaggerations, as you can see from the source itself. Now, another thing you could say about the source is something to do with the content. Now, the content is basically referring to the Berlin blockade. And from your own knowledge, you know that the Berlin blockade was an actual reason for the creation of NATO, as one of the reasons for creating NATO was a support against the USSR. And you can say this is evident in the Berlin airlift in order to support that point. But the main thing about here, remember the question. The question is talking about the usefulness of the sources. How useful are they as evidence? Back to the source. Now, because this source is mentioning the Berlin blockade, which was a reason for the creation of NATO, it is useful because it does talk about the reason for the creation of NATO. But a limitation could be is that it only shows one, which is the Berlin blockade. Now, on to the next source. Source C is from a letter written by Philip Jessup to President Truman, April 1949. Jessup was a senior U.S. representative at the United Nations from 1945 to 1949. That is your nature, origin, purpose. Remember, they usually put it like at the top of the source, so you can refer to that. I'm going to read the source for you. There are aspects of Soviet policy which have caused a feeling of insecurity in Europe. One aspect is the Soviet failure to cooperate with the United Nations. Secondly, there is the Soviet acceptance that there will be a series of conflicts with the West. The United Nations can help to reduce or end this insecurity by making a strong and clear statement of its aims. The North Atlantic Treaty does this. The treaty is a reasonable response to the development in international relations since 1945. Okay, so let's talk about the nature, origin, purpose of the source. Now, Philip Jessup, because this is a letter written by him, and he is a senior U.S. representative at the United Nations, you could say that there is some, distant. The nature, origin, purpose is distant from the actual question, because he has nothing to do with NATO. So that could be a limitation for nature, origin, purpose. There's nothing much really you could talk about for usefulness of the nature, origin, purpose. The main things are in the content. So the good thing about the content, the thing that makes it useful, is the fact that it mentions 3 reasons for the creation of NATO. Aspects of Soviet policy have caused a feeling of insecurity, Soviet failure to cooperate with the United Nations, and Soviet acceptance that there will be a series of conflicts with the West. And the fact that the source has this range of reasons makes it very reliable, as it is representative as a whole. And you could use your own knowledge when it says here the Soviet accepts that there will be a series of conflicts with the West. By referring to your own knowledge, you could mention that the Berlin airlift is an example of this, adding credibility to the source as there were a series of conflicts. Okay, so the content, it's basically, its focus is on the reasons for the creation of NATO, even though the nature, origin, and purpose may not have intended it to be. It is mainly talking about the reasons, so that is useful as evidence. There's a few bad things you could say about the source, but I'm not going to talk about them because we're wasting time. So remember, look at the nature, origin, purpose of the source, look at the content. You have to mention at least 1 positive, 1 negative about each source. Doesn't matter whether it's for content or for NOP. But you have not gotten 10 marks yet. In order to get that last mark, you have to say which source is better and why. So like a mini conclusion. So I would say the source C is better, but you can say the source B is better. It doesn't matter as long as you justify your conclusion, your point. I would say the source C is better because it has more than 1 reason, unlike source B, which has only 1 reason for the USA's involvement in the creation of NATO. And so source C is more useful because, well, it has more reasons, more reliable, as well as more information and more detailed. Yeah. Next question. So for question 4, you have to describe the key features. First of all, how do you answer this question? This question is 6 marks, so you should spend 9 minutes on it, because it's a minute and a half per mark. So you have to give at least 2 points, but I usually give 3. But if you give 2 points and develop them really well, then you can get 6 marks, 6 out of 6. But if you do have more than 1 key feature which you can write down, then write it down, because if you have 3 points, you do not have to develop them as much as if you had 2 points. So how do you develop your things? Well, first of all, you have to state your point. Then you have to give evidence. And after you've given evidence, develop it a bit. It's like 3 mini P paragraphs. But if you have 2 points, then make the P paragraphs longer and add more explanation or more examples. But I'm going to go through these questions with 3 points, 3 key features. Now, as you can see, there are 2 choices which they will give you for this question. I'm going to go through both choices and fairly quickly. So, yeah. Okay, so 1 key feature you could say is that the decisions made about Germany at the Potsdam Conference were to do with Nazis. Evidence or example, they decided to ban the Nazi Party and prosecute surviving Nazis as war criminals. And you have to explain or develop this. It meant that the Grand Alliance has control of Germany. Now, another point, the division of Germany, which is really the most obvious one that everyone should think of. Evidence or example, it was divided into 4 zones controlled by Britain, France, USA, and the USSR. And you should explain or develop this point. And each of these countries administered its zone as it saw fit. So each country could control its zone as it wanted. Another point was there were some disagreements about the decisions made by Germany. For example, the reparations. The USSR wanted to impose heavy reparations on Germany, but the USA wanted Germany to recover. So those are 3 key features. Remember to always signpost and relate to the question. That should get you 6 marks, but that's what I would put. This is the most obvious one, but remember, if you can't think of 3, write down 2, but develop them more. Next option. Okay, so there are many key features you could say for the Bay of Pigs invasion, but these are the 3 that I have picked. There was a ground invasion attempt. Example, the La Brigada, made of 2,506 soldiers. They landed, and they encountered 20,000 soldiers. Develop it or add more explanations or examples. 100 of the brigada were killed, and 1,100 were imprisoned, and so the invasion failed. Another feature, the CIA was involved. They trained the La Brigada and assumed people will rise up with them against Castro. Obviously, they were wrong, so the invasion failed. But then I added a little bit more because that's basically the same as that, so you might not get credit for it. Also because Castro was aware of the imminent invasion and the plans for the invasion were actually overheard. Another feature, the invasion, the key features of the Bay of Pigs invasion, another feature was it had negative effects on the USA. Kennedy and USA were humiliated because of the huge failure. It wasn't just a failure, it was a huge failure. And so they began Operation Mongoose, which was covert operations to remove Castro from his leadership position. And also Castro was pushed further towards the USSR and further away from the USA. So USA relations worsened, whether it's with Cuba or with USSR. That should get you 6 out of 6 marks. Now for question 5. You have to explain the importance of 3 of the following in international relations. So they give you 4, but you have to only pick 3. And each one you pick, it's worth 5 marks. So in total, question 5 is 15 marks. So it's good that they give you a choice. So then if there's one topic that you are not that knowledgeable about, you can choose the 3 that you are knowledgeable about. Let's go through the first one. Explain the importance of the Truman Doctrine on international relations. So, what is the importance of the Truman Doctrine on international relations? Now, you should know that if you have no idea what the Truman Doctrine is, or no knowledge to support your answer, if you say how important it was with at least a little bit of explanation, you can get 2 out of 5. So never ever leave this question blank. So this is my answer. The Truman Doctrine was very important. And you have to name the consequences of the thing that they give you. And that's how you get the marks. So one consequence is it led to the creation of Marshall Aid, 1947, same year. And by 1953, $17 billion worth of aid were given to war-torn countries. There's your precise knowledge. And this led to the formation of the Iron Curtain, because satellite states were not given Marshall Aid. And this created bitter divisions. You have to make your answer cohesive. It has to work together, it has to be fluent and flow. And that's what's going to get you the final mark. Because it's easy to get 4 out of 5, but hard to get 5 out of 5. Another consequence is the creation of Common Forum, which was in direct response to the Truman Doctrine, as well as Comecon. And it showed the divisions between the USSR and the USA. That might get you 4. To get that 5th mark, make it more cohesive, make it flow, but also very important in doing what to international relations? Well, very important in negatively affecting international relations. You can make that more specific by saying it created more bitter divisions, a larger divide between the USSR, the USA, East Europe, and West Europe. And there are your 5 marks. Next. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all the options because the video is going to be too long. You know how to answer the questions, so have a go at them yourself and look at the mark scheme online. Let's go to the final question of the paper. So the final question in the paper is always going to be a question that has this format. Explain why relations between the USA and the Soviet Union or USSR changed in the years blah 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 to blah blah blah. So you have to know what happens in those years in order to use your information. And you can see it does tell you must also include information of your own. If you don't, you are limited to, I think, below 10 or below 9 marks. And so they also do give you 2 reasons of their own, which I would obviously use and have the third reason be a reason from your own. Basically, the structure of this question, it's P paragraphs, but not simple P paragraphs, big P paragraphs. Point, evidence, lots and lots of evidence and own knowledge, precise knowledge, and the main thing, explain. Explain and relate to the question for each example you give. And at the end, give a conclusion. You don't necessarily have to give an introduction, but it is mandatory to give a conclusion and make a judgment and justify. Okay, so why did relations change in the years 1979 to 87? I have given 2 points from my own knowledge, the invasion of Afghanistan, but also they did talk about the Carter Doctrine, but I'm going to link that to the invasion of Afghanistan because they are closely linked. And then I'm going to talk about Reagan's attitude towards communism, and then lastly Gorbachev, because he was very important in international relations. So the invasion of Afghanistan started on the 25th of December 1979. Here is the question where you give your own knowledge and really impress the examiner. But the most important thing to do in this question is to explain. There is no point just putting own knowledge without explaining what it means and how it relates to the question, how it changed international relations. So the USSR, they spent $8 billion per year to continue the fighting in Afghanistan, whereas the USA, they actually supported and funded the opposition, which was the Mujahideen. And so what does this show about international relations? It shows the heightened rivalry. It shows that the USA and the US are actually going against each other, even if it's not directly. And so it's worsening relations. The Carter Doctrine is closely linked to the division of Afghanistan because it meant that the USA would be involved in it. And it stated that the USA will defend their interests in the Persian Gulf. And so it shows that the USA is willing to go against the USSR, showing the worsening of relations. And the consequence of this is actually the Senate passing of SALT II was delayed, which shows that relations have really worsened so much that any chance of putting them back together is highly low. Of course, until you get to Gorbachev. And you have to say, for this question, you have to state the significance of each point you make. You have to say which one is more significant, which one is least significant. So at the end of each paragraph, say, this was very significant in doing blah 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 to international relations. And so for this one I would say, the invasion of Afghanistan and the Carter Doctrine were very significant in worsening international relations. Now, Reagan's attitude towards communism. He would rather be dead than red, which shows his deep hatred for communism and therefore the USSR. Another thing of my own knowledge is the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, which intensified the arms race, and it shocked the USSR, and it meant that there was a possibility of winning a nuclear war. And so relations, the rivalry heightened, tensions up, and also his $1 trillion defense program, 1981, it showed that the USA is ready for a nuclear war. They are ready to go against the USSR. It's increasing tensions, similar to how the Strategic Defense Initiative increased tensions, but not that much. Now, the war of words with Andropov, Reagan called the USSR an evil empire, whereas Andropov said Reagan is like Hitler, he's fanning the flames of war. It shows the heightened rivalry, as these are both insulting and negative. And now, the significance. You have to remember the significance. Reagan's attitude towards communism was extremely significant in worsening international relations. Now to Gorbachev. So, Gorbachev. There is loads you can say about him, about how he changed international relations. You won't necessarily have time for all of them, but I'm going to go through most of them. Glasnost, openness. Remember he introduced these, what do you call them? Let's call them reforms. Dissidents should be released from prison, and the government should be more open, less corruption. Also perestroika, which means reconstruction. And elements of capitalism will be introduced to help the economy recover, because the economy was really bad at that time. He would also abandon the Brezhnev doctrine, so the USSR would stop intervening in Europe, and in 1989 Gorbachev actually accepts the Warsaw Pacts to make any internal changes they want. And the main thing is that you can link to your first point, withdraw from Afghanistan and reduce military spending, which links to your point on Afghanistan, because the invasion of Afghanistan actually worsened relations, and here Gorbachev is mending relations. Example, this led to so many treaties or conferences, Geneva, Reykjavik, and eventually the INF Treaty in 1987. Gorbachev basically, he was the reason for the end of the arms race. Gorbachev was extremely significant in changing international relations for the better, for mending them. So mending international relations, positive effect. He had an extremely significant effect. And for the conclusion, you have to give a conclusion. In conclusion, Gorbachev was the most significant reason for change, who had the, how do you say this? Oh yes, Gorbachev had the biggest impact in changing international relations, as he basically mended all the worsening of relations with the invasion of Afghanistan, the Carter Doctrine, Reagan's attitude towards communism. He mended everything, and he had a huge positive impact on it. Because of all his reforms, his acceptance of the USSR is not working out, because it also led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. So yeah, that's how you answer the 13-mark question. And also you do get 3 more marks for SPAG, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So after you finish, and if you have time, I doubt you will, but if you have time, go over and check your spelling and sentence structures and stuff like that. Bye!